Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to be doing a review and a little bit of a summary of The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, whom we have read several of his books now, with the subtitle How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Creating an Epidemic of Mental Illness. So what the Great Epidemic is kind of the move from being offline and engaging in play and activities with friends and this sort of thing to moving online in engaging specifically with social media, but also just being online in general. Now, Jonathan Haidt, in terms of background, is a psychologist, and this is a distinction we've made kind of multiple times in the past, but I think it's worth repeating, is the types of authors that write these kind of informational sciencey books kind of come in, roughly speaking, two categories. There's the categories that are science-oriented and are going to be, scientists by trade, not mechanics, certainly, for those loud cars outside. And these ones are going to generally have a higher fidelity to the information, the evaluation of the information, and also sussing out what is accurate and what is truly going on. And they will also tend to be worse authors. In general, Jonathan Haidt has been getting better and better as an author, in my opinion, although this is a book on a topic that we've kind of, social media, we've already read a lot about, and so to that extent, a lot of the information was stuff we already knew, and so it wasn't necessarily as engaging, but I think Jonathan Haidt, his first book wasn't very good, in terms of like writing overall. I think he's getting better and better, just in a general sense. But I also think he's a really clean and strong thinker, and that this is a strong juxtaposition with the second category of people who make these types of books, which is that they are either journalists or like authors in general, and in particular they like to push narratives and have this sort of entertainment is more their vibe, or they are trying to push a particular like narrative or message, and often this is at the sacrifice or the trade-off that gets made, is that they are more selective with the information, and rather than trying to get at the truth, they are trying to make a particular narrative that looks a particular way, and so the information's not as good, but man, they're generally more entertaining. An example of an author I really like that would be in the second category, just to like remark that I don't think it's the scientist is the good type and the journalist communicator is the bad type. An author that's in kind of the second category would be Malcolm Gladwell, whom I don't think mistreats information that much, but he is selective towards pushing particular narratives, and some of the explanations are maybe a little bit off of what I think would be the best inferences. With that said, Jonathan Haidt opens up the book at the first chapter, which is part one of the book, which is a title bleed, and it's the name of the chapter is The Surge of Suffering, and in it he looks through a lot of the information. Now, we aren't going to summarize a bunch of the studies. He includes a bunch of graphs in here, as you might be able to see. We aren't going to summarize a bunch of the studies, but the idea is he's looking at, okay, what's the cause of this massive depression and this type of stuff? And he looks at a bunch of different variables, a bunch of different explanations, and he looks at it in a kind of thorough way. I think the chapter's like 40 pages, which is a little bit long, but the main idea is he is going to point the finger at social media, largely also kids getting smartphones around the 2010, kind of as a serious inflection point where the great rewiring, which is a term he's kind of coined, began. And also, he is going to look at other explanations and explain why those are not the case for this. And so I think he does a good job of that, and that is kind of the first chapter. And then we settle in to the second part of the book, which is going to be about childhood as it was before, and what is important about old childhood and now what is missing. And so part two is called The Backstory, The Decline of Play-Based Childhood. And he's going to make the strong argument that it is not only is it being online in the social media way negative in a lot of ways, he's going to make that argument later, but also the opportunity cost of being online is that you're not offline anymore, and that play direct face-to-face with kids is fundamentally, or with other children, is fundamentally important, especially the type of play that's unsupervised, because when an adult is mediating all of your interactions, you don't get a chance to actually learn very, very critical skills for kids or adults, which is how to play with other people and resolve conflicts. And do all this sorts of stuff, which if an adult resolves all of your conflicts, you can't do this. We're going to get to it in a minute, but he talks a bit about safetyism, or I guess we'll get to it right now, which is a term that he coined in the coddling of the American mind. Now, the coddling of the American mind was looking primarily at adults who were attending university, and why there's been a movement towards, to oversimplify it, let's say, this safe spaces types of orientation instead of this open discourse where you can talk about anything in a college setting type of orientation. And he attributed it to 4 causes, but one of them, I'm not going to talk about the other 3. One of them is the safetyism, and the fact that since the 90s there has been kind of a pulling back of the kids in general from being able to engage in free and open play with other kids. There's kind of some amusing / horrific anecdotes he gives where like a parent lets their kid ride the subway by themselves and they get reported to Child Protective Services. But fundamentally, you get a sense of agency and accomplishment from being able to do stuff on your own. You learn from being able to do stuff on your own. And so this is going to be an important thing. And this is kind of what the second section is about. The first chapter of the second section, which is the second chapter of the book, is called What Children Need to Do in Childhood. And in this, he discusses free play and how it helps to develop, skills and agency. But in particular, there's kind of 2 things I wanted to focus on from this chapter. And the first is this distinction between synchronous activity, which is if I'm interacting with someone face to face, I can get immediate feedback from them, they can get immediate feedback from me, and this is the nature of social interaction as we have evolved as human beings. This is the nature of our social interaction, and this is the kind of interaction we need in order, like kind of as a basic human need, but it is a sharp sort of contrast with how interacting with people online is, which is that interacting with people online is asynchronous. This video, you cannot interact with me. I cannot interact with you. I have pre-recorded this video and I'm putting it online. There's no interaction that is going on like in a real-time sort of way. And if this is the only medium through which you are interacting with people, that is me putting out this video. If this is the only way I'm interacting with people, but also you, if this is the only way you are receiving interaction from people, you're not learning kind of this fundamental or experiencing this fundamental synchronous interaction. There's a fundamental difference that's going on with this asynchronicity. That's a word I shouldn't have attempted to say. But also, the online sort of thing is you are curating kind of this identity for yourself online that is performative. And I think that this is critical as well. And so I think that noting this difference in synchronicity is important and is a critical one. And another thing that I thought was particularly important from the chapter was this idea of like role models and who it is you're going to copy. Human beings are social learners. And you learn a lot of things, not because you've thought your way through it or because you've read it in a book, but just by imitating those around you. Well, when your attention and your awareness is fundamentally online, the people around you even aren't really the ones that are physically there with you. If you are living in your online social media world as you're attending school and you're thinking about what text you're going to reply to or what someone posted or this and that and those sorts of things, you're in another place cognitively, right? Your attention is in another place. And what Haidt kind of points out is 2 biases, which I think are important to note, which is the conformity bias and a prestige bias. I had some thoughts kind of extended on top of Haidt's discussion here, but conformity bias is you tend to conform to the people around you. Okay. Prestige bias is whoever appears to be the highest status in the room, you tend to imitate them. Okay. All well and fine. These are biases. They aren't necessarily good things, right? This is kind of how human beings learn to behave. Obviously, sometimes you conform and do bad things, and sometimes you copy a role model who's bad, and sometimes the car is just loud outside. But what I think is significant is when you are doing this in an offline setting, the people who you are copying are probably going to be better role models. And Haidt doesn't really beat this bush particularly aggressively, but I do think that this is an interesting thing because when you look at who selects or how the algorithm of like online media, both social media and otherwise, selects information, it is going to have certain biases. The biases tend to be towards sensationalism and tribalism and this types of things. So the people who propagate to the top or show up on your feed, in particular, tend to be more sensationalistic, more performative, these sorts of things. And if that is where your attention is, and your attention is not with, teachers, community leaders, parents, these types of things as examples, or even just older students, older kids within kind of your community, if your attention is still on or is fixed in this online media, that means the people with whom you're conforming are going to be kind of this online sphere, if that's where your attention is, and the people who you are exhibiting prestige bias towards is going to be those people as well, which aren't necessarily good people. They are the people that are particularly good at navigating towards the top of the attentional food chain on social media, which again has a bias towards sensationalism and whatever drives engagement, not necessarily personal fulfillment. Being a very angry and bitter person online can be very good for getting a lot of engagement. It is not a good strategy for feeling fulfilled as an individual. And so I thought that was also an important distinction, although again, Haidt doesn't belabor it too much. He does kind of note that there's a movement away from this sort of community, and community again is synchronous if you're interacting face to face. He, in chapter 3, which is titled Discover Mode and the Need for Risky Play, he talks about how there's kind of two modes, a reactive sort of defense mechanism sort of mode, and that social media in particular exacerbates this because a lot of the times you are getting judged in extremely short spans of times. People are way more judgmental online, way more negative and nasty, and that when you are thrust into most of your attention and your feeling of your own social status, because this is kind of what people are doing subconsciously or consciously. They're always like, where is my status? He even discusses this in the book. I forget the term he uses for this. And whenever you feel like you've got knocked down a little bit, this hurts. And in particular, that happens a lot in social media, and there's a high risk of it in social media, and everything's scrutinized. And so this puts you in defense mode rather than being in creative and learn mode. And so Haidt notes this. And in this chapter, he also talks about safetyism, which we discussed a little bit, but it is the philosophy that parents feel that they have to defend their kids against everything, leads to kind of helicopter parenting and not letting the kids go out and learn on their own and take risks on their own and these types of things, which are fundamental to development. But he also talks about anti-fragility, which is a term that was coined, I think, by Nassim Taleb. Yeah, I think that was the guy. But the idea is that if something like a glass, a crystal glass is fragile, if you throw it at the ground, it will break. And then there's things that are durable that aren't fragile, like a brick, relatively durable, although if you throw a brick hard enough at the ground, it'll break. And then there's things that when they get pressured or tested, they grow stronger. And he makes the argument, Haidt makes the argument that kids are anti-fragile. If you don't test them at all, and they never have to experience stress and this type of stuff, they won't develop. But if you test them and they experience challenge, they will develop as human beings. And that fundamentally, this culture of safetyism inhibits their ability to grow as human beings. And then there's chapter 4, which is titled Puberty and the Blocked Transition to Child Adulthood. And in this chapter, he talks about, or kind of two of the key ideas, I think, is that there's less rites of passage just generally with everyone being chronically online that are socially significant, for children coming up and this type of thing. And one that I thought was particularly noteworthy or interesting was that there's less adult experiences for kids. Now, this is something that is kind of, in some ways, if there's less underage drinking, that's a good thing. There's also less getting your driver's license early, which is not necessarily a good thing, which is kind of the rites of passage thing. Basically, everything that kids do or sort of come up and is an indication of growing up is on the more here on the downslope. So, but in particular, I thought the drinking one was particularly interesting because, you're like underage drinking down. That's great. Well, the reason that it's down is because adolescents don't hang out with each other as much. Right? They are not socializing as much. They are just chronically shut in and just online and just scrolling, which means they're missing out on fundamental formative like periods, like approaching a girl and like asking her out to prom or whatever. And it's if you're just chronically online or you're doing it online, which doesn't have any of the other, it's a disembodied, once again, asynchronistic type of thing that's not in line with kind of what it is to be human, unless you're going to take the view that humanity just needs to develop around kind of just everything just being online. But it is not something that we've evolved for. There are a bunch of social cues that are like contextually relevant, that are like important, and these are just like left out. But that's kind of section 2 or part 2, which is the backstory, which the tagline of that is the decline of place-based childhood. And so that's kind of the thrust. For more things on like this type of exploration, I would recommend his other book, The Coddling of the American Mind. But that brings us to section 3, which is the Great Rewiring, which in large part is kind of the big thrust or thesis of this overall book, which the tagline is The Rise of the Phone-Based Childhood. And so chapter 5 is the 4 foundational harms, which the chapter is about these. We have social deprivation, we have sleep deprivation, attention fragmentation, and addiction. And I wasn't paying attention when I read the attention fragmentation one, so I couldn't tell you about it. But no, so like we have these 4 things. We have the social deprivation. We're kind of already getting at that with contrasting being online to being in person. So we've kind of already covered that a little bit, but there's definitely more ideas. There's sleep deprivation, and this book is less about the perniciousness of social media in general and how engaging and addictive it is. Haidt does talk about this a little bit. For a kind of better look into that, I'd recommend Tristan Harris's documentary on Netflix. I forget what it's called. I think it's Social Dilemma, maybe. But in particular, social media is designed to be as engaging as possible, because the way that the companies that run those make money is by ad revenue and maximizing hours that you spend looking at the screen. They are not incentivized for your well-being. And Haidt does talk about this a little bit. And in particular, if you are getting something for free, or if the thing's free, then you are the product. They are selling your attention to advertisers, effectively speaking, and they determine in a large part what you see in this type of stuff, and they just want to maximize the eyeballs. And so the more of your attention they can extract from you, with which to sell to advertisers, and this is obviously an adversarial framing that is like based on extracting, right? That we're kind of the metaphors we're using. They're extracting your attention from you and then selling it, kind of like you would extract a mine from a ground, make miners miners again. And so the children yearn for the mines. And so if you're taking this resource and then selling it, they're gonna prefer you to not sleep and instead be on their thing and to compulsively engage with the social media. And in particular, he references in the sleep deprivation section, he references a quote where I forget which company it was. I think it was Netflix maybe, but they just say at the margin, we're not competing with like this other company like Disney Plus or whatever it is, the competitor. It might not have been Netflix who was the CEO. At the margin, we're competing with sleep, which is just like, bruh. That is telling, because a lot of the people who run these and design these social media things know what they're doing, but also simultaneously, there is a problem in that it's a collective problem, because if they don't do it, a different social media company's going to do it, and then they're going to take over. So fundamentally, there's a little bit of a problem, and also there's a survivorship bias. The social media companies that have been willing to maximize engagement to the detriment of their users. Those are the ones that are around now because the other ones just went under, or were bought out, or were assimilated into the great beast. So that's sleep deprivation. Attention fragmentation. They talk about how, that one should be a little bit self-explanatory, but how your attention span is definitely significantly decreased. And in particular, I think it's in this section that he talks about a bunch of self-report studies where students report that, or adolescents report that they are just constantly online, and online in terms of being in their head and thinking about replying to messages, receiving messages, all this stuff, all throughout school, and how this is also eating into potentially or probably, performance academically speaking. I feel like myself not being able to give really concrete examples is just like, I'm super self-conscious about it right now because I feel like my attention was fragmented. But I got through the whole book. Okay. And then it talks about addiction, which kind of harkens back to they're designed to maximize engagement. In particular, I don't think Haidt's book mentions this, but Tristan Harris, I know, has mentioned it. I think that I first encountered this with, I forget his name, but the gambling machines in particular. There are people, or there's this book on gambling, and there's this passage in there that I just find really striking, which is that the really, really hyper gamblers will just sit at the machine, cranking out the slots, and they'll just piss themselves as they're at the machine. And this is just insane, in my mind. And they will intentionally, knowing that they're likely to piss themselves, they will intentionally wear dark pants so no one can tell. This is like a dirty type of thing that is present in casinos, which is like they gotta clean the piss. But it's this full maximizing engagement type of design principles that underlie the slot machines that make it so that behavior like this happens. The same kind of design principles are applied to social media. And the most striking to me metaphor analogy is that refreshing your feed, you pull down on the thing. This is something that's been designed to have a mechanical feel, like the user experience of pulling down is something that you could just refresh with just a button, but instead you're refreshing with a pull down. They found that this increases the rate at which people refresh the page, or it increases their engagement, overall engagement with the social media program or this type of thing. What's really striking to me is there's a fundamental analogy right there, right? Pulling down on the slot machine handle is very much like pulling down on the refresh. But he does talk about addiction, and in particular, another striking point of that is that what is created with social media engagement is a lot of dopamine. But there's a disjunction between dopamine and satisfaction. Just because you're being stimulated doesn't mean that you're happy or you feel fulfilled. You're just stimulated. Interestingly enough, though, there's a psychologist. He wrote the book Iconoclast. I can't remember his name right now. Or neuroscientist, actually, not a psychologist. I think his study was more on the brain specifically. But he has an interesting thesis that satisfaction is dopamine plus cortisol, or that is novelty plus challenge. He kind of couches it in novelty plus challenge, but thinks of novelty as dopamine and challenge as cortisol. So it's a little bit interesting to kind of read from Haidt his argument that dopamine alone is not satisfaction, or kind of this throwaway comment that dopamine's not satisfaction. I think it's important, but also the lack of challenge or the lack of cortisol is kind of a little bit of a significant thing, and it brings back how a lot of this online stuff is very disembodied and not challenging in the same way. It is like engagement without the stress, and so moving away from kind of formative and critical periods that might be stressful, but also might lead to satisfaction and fulfillment and the feeling that you're growing as an individual. That is the challenge being reinserted in. Okay. Well, the sixth chapter is why social media harms more girls than boys. And in particular, the statistics are a lot more stark with girls. But interestingly, as he'll talk about more in the boys chapter, the boys have been experiencing change that has been more long term since I think like the early 2000s. And a lot of the stuff that is driving kind of issues with the boys is present in the combination of porn and video games as well. And girls, it's more centered on the social media itself. But in particular, there's still a huge spike for boys around 2010, which is when you have the smartphone in your pocket, right? When you have access to all the stuff all the time. And there's no sort of embodied and offline sphere anymore, because this creates a constant engagement, if not engaged directly, thinking about this, responding to it, attending to it. When you don't feel anything, but you think you felt your leg vibrate and you like check your phone, just this constant like sort of, even if you're not directly online, you're thinking about being online. But in particular, social media is more acutely experienced as being problematic for girls. He talks about this distinction between agency and communion, and how girls strive more for communion and the feeling of belonging, whereas boys strive more for a sense of accomplishment or agency, which I thought was a bit of an interesting distinction or discussion, considering agency is like a topic that I've read a lot about and think a lot about. He also notes that girls in particular are very sensitive to visual comparison, and so they will, because girls' status in general is much more based on their appearance than it is for boys. For boys, it's much more based on like what you accomplish in this type of thing, and because of that, you become very sensitive to comparing yourself to other girls. And then if you move from being offline, engaged with another group of people that's much more representative of your community, and then you're making social comparisons there, you'll probably be about average, because you'll be about average. But if you're comparing yourself online, the people who win the attention game online are like the most beautiful people in general, and if you're comparing yourself to them, chances are you're not going to fare that well, because if you are probably at the 50th percentile and they are probably at the 1 percentile, you're probably going to have a little bit of a hard time. And it is this comparison. There's like an expression like comparison is the theft of joy, or this type of thing. And I think about this a lot in the gym specifically, because when I go to the gym, I'm almost always, I can't remember the last time I wasn't the strongest person in the gym. I can kind of remember one. There was a guy who actually held the world record, or the national record for deadlifting, but it was in like the 50 kilo category or 48 kilo category. So the guy's like 100 pounds, and I can deadlift more than he can, but just barely. And so technically, this is such a tangent. Technically, he's like stronger than me in some sense, but like in an absolute sense, I'm stronger than him. But accounting for body weight, he would be stronger than me. But the point is in the gym, I get like strength dysmorphia when I think about how strong I am, because the people I'm comparing myself to are the people who I see online, who are the literal strongest people on the planet, and these are the people who show up in my feed, and then I'm like, I wish I was strong. And then I go to the actual gym, when I'm online thinking about how strong I am, I'm like, man, I am. And then when I go to an actual gym, I'm literally the strongest person there, basically every time. And the fact that in my head I can think of myself as being, I'm strong, but I'm not that strong, is a little nuts, right? And I do think that this is kind of an analog for like the attractiveness and the self-perception, but it distorts. You're living in a distorted reality, and then it's going to distort your perspective in terms of your real world perspective. This is such a tangent. He also talks about relationship aggression, which is that men tend to be more when men are engaged in any type of conflict, they tend to be more physically aggressive, and women tend to be more aggressive in terms of relationships. So they'll try and sabotage relationships instead of just getting straight up violent. And in particular, this plays out quite nastily with social media. And so this is another reason why social media is generally worse, in particular for girls. Let's see. It is easier, and then kind of the final point that I wanted to mention is that of this chapter is it is easier for men to be predatory online and get away with it and suffer no consequences than it is in person. If a girl's with her dad and you do something inappropriate with her, you are way more likely to be punched in the face than if you just slide into a girl's DMs online. And in particular, we're talking about adolescents when we're talking about girls. We're talking about not just like females, not women, but we're talking about adolescents here. They are basically, there's an extreme ease of access towards vulnerable people, and this opportunity is created by social media, which, and this is kind of a later point in the book, they don't really police at all. You have to say that you're 13 or whatever to sign up. This is the number in the US. The guy who originally created that legislation wanted it to be 16. Haidt thinks it should be 16. Various corporate interests lobbied to bring it down to 13. So 13 is the number. You have to be 13 to sign up for social media, or you have to be 13 to create an account. Oversimplifying it, you have to be 13 to sign up for social media, but all you have to do is ever just say you're 13. There's no verification process, and there's no penalty to companies that allow you online before you're 13. And these things, there are practical solutions to this. Won't go into the details. Some are offered up in this book, but the point is that there's effectively no protections because there's no enforcement of any type of law or rule. I read my YouTube statistics, and it's like, there's on some of them you have to understand that a good chunk of people who create YouTube accounts just say they're 18 so they get access to all the content, no matter if they're younger than 18. And so this is kind of present, and it creates this ease of access to a vulnerable population that would not otherwise be there in a more offline kind of setting. But the fact that so much has been moved online, there are not these protections in place. And this kind of harkens to, Haidt's kind of primary point, and also it's mirrored. So over here, the quote we have here on the splash here, which is that overprotected in the real world and underprotected online. There's effectively no protections online. Which brings us to kind of the 7th chapter here, which is what is happening to boys. And the emphasis here is a little bit different, and it's a little bit pulled off of social media in particular and more on video games and porn, but there's more failure to launch amongst boys. There's also a movement, failure to launch meaning that they don't get their career started, they're not attending schools, they just completely withdraw to their dungeon, or however you want to view it, their mom's basement, whatever it is. And I think that this one, this number is way, way, way up. And I think that it is driven, and Haidt talks about this, in a large sense, not getting the feeling of agency by engaging in these actions earlier on when you're younger, this risk-taking behavior, these kind of rites of passage that are no longer present, and this also feeling of agency in the real world, because there's kind of withdrawal to video games, and porn is a solution to feel a sense of agency. And these, in some ways, are easier and more accessible ways of giving yourself this feeling of agency without actually having to take a risk. And so it is this removal of this kind of risk element and identity building that creates this sense of listlessness. He also talks about how there's this movement from externalizing more generally, which is what men do more generally than women, to internalizing and the shunning of risk, and this substituting relationships, with porn, can't say the forbidden word on the internet, and then also substituting real agency and problem solving and risk taking with video games, because video games are more accessible. And then at the addiction level, when becomes like, at a certain point, a lot of males are playing video games to escape the real world, and kind of forget who they are in the real world because it's not palatable, because they don't have a sense of contribution or agency in the real world. And you get these sense of contribution and agency. It's like a catch-22. You get the sense of these things by actually engaging in the real world. And if there are varying things that really rev up your dopamine that discourage you from engaging in the real world, either from just pulling you in that direction or pushing you away from the offline stuff, then you're going to have more of this. And then there's also a discussion of how community used to be much more grounded. And much of the community, and this is true with women as well, or girls as well, but with boys, is not as grounded. When you are online, and you are playing games with someone online, it is social, but the social grouping is a shifting sands type of thing, where you're not, I guess I should have said throughout all this, the Great Rewiring starts in 2010. I think I said it earlier, but like that's when kids were started getting cell phones at adolescence, and so people went through formative years, 11 to 15, from then. It acutely affected in terms of the timeline. But going back to the point, which is the people you're interacting with are constantly changing when you're playing video games, and it creates this very short-term type of relationship thing, and the relational strategies you develop when you are immersed in this type of sphere, you have to think about what it is you're being conditioned to do. Whereas this offline kind of, I don't want to say normal, but let's say more historic version of, okay, you want to get with a girl, you want to get with in a relationship, this type of thing, and okay, well, what do you have to do offline? You have to put yourself in risk, you have to put yourself out there, you have to approach the girl, this type of thing, and you have to see if it works out. And simultaneously, this is synchronistic, and you're receiving immediate feedback. If you satisfy that need with corn, there's so many of the things are just no longer present in terms of how that interaction would have needed to go. And similarly, when you're getting a sense of agency or accomplishment from video games, video games allow you to restart really easy. They let you, you can just swap to a different video game if things aren't working out. There's zero friction. You can just find a new game, resign, start a new lobby, all these types of things. And this type of thing doesn't necessarily play out in the real world. To some extent it does. You can change career paths, but I think that the way it's conditioning you is perhaps such that it's going to this instant satisfaction. Instant satisfaction. I can't conjugate that word. Instant satisfaction, gratification, instant gratification. There's the word. This instant gratification type of thing. When you don't experience it in the real world, you might become frustrated and withdraw inward. And so with both women and with a sense of agency, for which there is, this is how men are judged. Women are judged more by their appearances. Men are judged more by what they can do and this type of stuff. It is easier to get more frustrated if you've conditioned yourself on a thing where there's zero friction and zero frustration. Although not zero. Video games can be frustrating too, but you get the type of thing that I'm trying to unpack here. And so he talks about that a little bit. And then in chapter 8, which is spiritual elevation and degradation, this is a bit of an interesting one because Haidt, in his first book, which is The Happiness Hypothesis, he talks about a lot of different, religious leaders and spiritual type of stuff. Haidt is an atheist. And so I find his ability to be analytic about this, and also The Righteous Mind. The Righteous Mind discusses why politics and religion separate people. I think Haidt's kind of analysis of religion and people being religious and like this stuff in general is very strong. But he does talk about a spiritual element, how this is kind of being removed by this online sphere as well. I don't think we'll get too into it, but notably he argues that there's like, or he puts up this distinction for your viewing, let's say, which is that there's a profane type of sphere and a sacred type of sphere, and that there are things that elevate us and things that degrade us, and that in general, judging of others that is very heavy tends to be more degradational and bring you down to a type of sphere where you are more self-conscious rather than being more community-oriented or being awestruck by something such that you think that the world is much bigger and more important than yourself, which would be something that's more elevating. And that social media in particular just tends to be very judgmental. And this tends to make us just very inside our own heads and reactive and insecure and all these types of things. And that this is a negative. And that, it brings us more in line with the profane. And maybe a good example of this is that going out in nature and experiencing something in nature is an experience that's very distinctive from just like looking at a picture of it, whereas when you go in person, generally you can experience a sense of awe. He describes awe as an emotion. He talks about studies on it, this type of thing, and that the realization that the world's bigger than yourself. If you think that the world's much bigger than yourself, it's much harder to be insecure about things, right? So if you have this elevating experience or this spiritual experience, it's useful. He also talks about meditation. In particular, meditating is like the inverse of being, pulling on the refresh button to be as stimulated as possible, in the sense that you're letting your mind be as still as possible and trying not to be stimulated by anything. And so he argues how that's elevating. And then you contrast kind of the nature thing with like experiencing out online. Like a picture of a waterfall online is just fundamentally so much different. And he talks about how embodiment's important and significant. So that those are some kind of ideas from that chapter. Then there's chapter 9, which is starting part 4, which is collective action for a healthier childhood. Now, for this, I think that this is generally speaking more relevant for parents, but the TLDR of this entire section, we'll talk about it very, very kind of briefly, is that you should, the TLDR for this entire section is you should allow kids to play outside more and have more unsupervised play with a lot of very heavy qualification. This is a 61 kind of page thing, but we're also starting to go pretty long here. But also that 16 is probably a good point for social media. I think an important distinction, though, is he talks about how problems tend to be collective. And how this is a difficult kind of problem for parents, which is, okay, imagine you have a bunch of cattle grazers, and we're going to talk about, collective problems and problems of the commons. Imagine you have a bunch of cattle grazers, and they all can graze, there's a field which they can all graze, and if they all just graze a little bit, a modest amount, there will be plenty of grass for everyone. But for each individual farmer or grazer, they're incentivized to just graze as much as possible because this leads to good outcomes for them. But if everyone does that, then the field will be completely dead. And this is a problem with the commons. In general, it would be better for kids, and Haidt recognizes this problem, for them all to be offline. However, if all the kids but your kid, or all the kids but one is offline, it's bad for the offline kid to... Also, it's bad for them to be offline. They should be online with their peer group, right? Is kind of the idea. And also, with parents, it's harder and harder to, or there's more and more instances where if everyone else is online, it's harder for you as a parent to tell your kid, no, you got to stay offline, this type of thing. And so, to some extent, it's a collective problem that is made... more exacerbated by the more people who are not kind of going the way of forcing their kids to go online, the easier it is to enforce, and the more people who are not doing that makes it harder and harder to do. But okay, and so action tends to need to be collective in a lot of ways, because community is the thing you are trying to bring back, because there's been like kind of an erasure of community. I think he has a metaphor that's a little bit interesting, which is that in regards to like overparenting and being overbearing and this type of thing, is that better metaphor for parenting is not being like a carpenter, where a carpenter measures precisely and they have a specific thing in mind when they start constructing, and then they like forge their kit out of wood, although forge is a blacksmith, so that maybe they craft their kit out of wood. Whereas instead, you should think of yourself as a gardener, which is you give your kids opportunities to grow, and then they'll grow in their own way and become their own person, this type of thing. But there's there's 4 chapters in here, which is preparing for collective action, what governments and tech companies can do now, what schools can do now, and what parents can do now. And I think that I don't think we need to summarize each of these, but these are each chapters of their own right, and they form an entire section. But they kind of flow from a lot of the ideas that we've already discussed. And then there's a conclusion. Interestingly, in the conclusion, I don't know if it was this take when I talked about it, or I haven't talked about it yet, but in the conclusion, he talks about how he wanted to write about, I think it might have even been elections. He wanted to write a book that was kind of in the larger sphere on the problems of the social media causes. And then he kind of wrote the first chapter of this book, and then he realized, no, we got to do like an entire book about kids and children and this type of thing, because there was so much there. And so I thought that this was pretty interesting. This is definitely where the book is focused, right? Which is that it's not focusing on social media writ large. And in some way, I think that makes this book like a little bit less universal, because it's in particular looking at a problem in terms of adolescence and childhood and this type of thing. But okay, let's get into the ratings, especially because this is getting pretty long. For utility, I gave it a 6. I think that there's not really too much implementable strategies, although I think being aware of these things is important. But still, there's probably a little bit... maybe I'm not giving height enough credit. Maybe the utility is really high if you're a parent, specifically. I think that's probably the case, and maybe the score should be a little bit higher. But I think if you're not a parent and you're not an adolescent, then in some regards the ship sailed a little bit on this information being useful. And so maybe it should be like conditionally more of like a 9 for parents and like a 5 for people outside the sphere of like someone growing up, because this is really where it's centered and focused. And I think that there's other information on social media and attention that's maybe more useful in the aggregate to the average person. But this is looking a little bit more at like kind of what's going on now in terms of adolescence. Although I do think that there should be major change. I just don't. I think it's perhaps useful at the collective level. Maybe if you wanted to talk about utility in that way, if it inspires you to collective action, then that's a useful thing. If you care about collective action, then that's a useful thing. Generally, we're thinking more at the individual level when we think about utility, but maybe that's a mistake as well. But we gave it a 6. For novelty, I gave it an 8.5. I think that there's a lot of sources and things on social media and attention and this type of stuff, but maybe that's my own bubble, and that's just the soup I'm swimming in. I think there's a lot of resources. I also think that this is like hands down one of the most important things to at least be semi-informed on. If the soup you're swimming in is this online kind of digital world, then you should at least know what flavor it is, right? You shouldn't drink the soup without at least inquiring as to what the flavor it is. You can't get all up in the Kool-Aid without knowing what flavor it is. You know what I mean? And I think that if you've never encountered anything on social media ever, or it's kind of like perniciousness, in regards to incentive structures and this type of stuff, I would just highly recommend. I actually wouldn't recommend this book. I would recommend watching Tristan Harris's documentary on Netflix, whose name is going to escape me, but I did say it earlier in the video. I would really recommend that. I think if you're a parent, I'd highly recommend this, but we'll get to that. But I gave it an 8.5 because even though I think you can encounter this type of thing, I think it's important to have encountered it. I think if you've already read a little bit on social media and incentive structures and stuff like this, that the novelty in this book goes really, really low. A lot of this information is kind of stuff I already have read about or known about, and then a lot of it, the stuff that's new, is just how depressed kids are, which is depressing in its own right, but this is not necessarily like a source as much for new information for me, but we still gave it an 8.5 on novelty. For entertainment, I gave it a 6. Maybe this is a little high. I think Haidt's writing style is getting better and better in general, although I don't think this is way better than The Coddling of the American Mind. I don't know if he'd even scored a higher score. I do think this issue is probably more important than what's going on in college level, but we gave it a 6. Relative to what it's trying to do, which is be like an information sciencey book, it's really good. And considering his background is not primarily being an author, but instead being an educator and a researcher, it's really good. And so, okay. For style, I gave it a 7.5. This is with the caveat that it is, and maybe this is a little bit too high. Maybe it should be a 7. But this is with the caveat that normally we're not seeing as much of researchers being this good in this type of thing. So was pretty good at writing. At least in my mind. I also really like the summaries at the end and this type of stuff. Maybe it should actually just be inverted and readability should be a 7.5 and style should be a 6.5. That'd probably be a little bit better, but this is how we rated it. But yeah, highly readable. At the end of every chapter, let's see if we can find the book. At the end of every chapter, there is a little bit of a summary. So like, if you really wanted to get the very short version, you can see in sum down here, there's just like a bullet point list of several of the things. I do think that it's very digestible in saying the thing and then repeating it in the summary makes it really easy. These should have been reversed. Readability should have been 6.5, and style should have maybe been an 8. But I do think it's very accessible. And then for interest, I gave it a 6.5. I think this is an interesting topic. I don't think necessarily everyone else would think it's an interesting topic. Interestingly enough, I think that if you're younger than me, I suppose, this is probably a very interesting topic because you're learning the flavor of the soup you've been swimming in. Although at this point, you've probably been marinating in it long enough that you kind of already know the flavor is a little bit bleak. But the seeing a lot of the data and how I was like at the cutoff. I graduated high school in 2010, and so the people who came after me, seeing like growing up in this like more online only rather than like embodied offline type of adolescence and high school experience. If you're in that kind of range, maybe this is highly interesting because it contextualizes how people who are older than you, their experience was dramatically different. And to be fair, I had a relatively protected like childhood compared to my peer group in terms of being overprotected, but I didn't have like the online sphere thing as much. I just like read a lot of books. And so it might be particularly interesting to see and read some of these things and also have the context of like where all this has come from in order to reach the point at which, if you're in that group, you have been, your upbringing was. Although obviously in place to place, it's going to be a bit different. So those are the ratings. Overall of 6.83. I think we already mentioned that this is the highest one this year, although I haven't read too many books this year, so only 6 books. But of the books, this has definitely been the best that we've read. As far as recommendations go, I think I would recommend this primarily to parents who are thinking about when their kids should have social media or this type of thing. I think that this book would be a huge hit then, or not hit. Hits like such. It's not the right word, but I think that this would be very useful to read. And also, I would recommend this to people who are between the ages of 11 and 15, I guess, just to provide some sort of context, but also simultaneously, it's going to be citing a whole bunch of studies. I don't know how readable this is for like a high schooler, which it might not be that readable. I don't really know. You could give it a crack. But those are kind of the two groups that I think that this would be the most useful for. And outside of that, I'm not sure. It's not that I would say that this book's bad and won't be useful at all. It's just there's a bunch of other things I'd recommend in front of it for a more generalized audience, I think. In particular, Tristan Harris's The Social Dilemma would be the first place I would start. And then there's other places to work from there. I think if you're in college, The Coddling of the American Mind would maybe be a little bit better. But this would also probably, if you're around that age range in college, maybe this would also be interesting. And so, yeah, I think that's where we are. Bit of a long video. If you like the videos longer, please comment. If you don't like the videos longer, I would say please comment, but you're not here by now. And if you're still here, I would say that you probably need to reevaluate how long you're just like listening to someone talk if you don't want to hear what he has to say. Yeah, you know, that sort of thing. If you like the video, feel free to like, comment, subscribe. I am definitely going to be trying to read a whole lot more, so expect to see more of this type of thing. And other than that, have a good one.